in an outpatient world now. So I'm so excited, Lauren, to be able to further talk about all things therapy and life and inner child work. And I am so happy to be here with you.
I'm so happy to have you here too, Sam. So looks like we just went live a few seconds ago. So for those of you just joining, I'll just give a little repeat. My name is Lauren Cassidy. I'm a singer-songwriter, a Gen Z mental health advocate. I write music and share stories about my life to help those who can relate to feel less alone and more understood. And Sam just gave us a brief introduction. She is a therapist who specializes in inner child work and helping people heal from eating disorders, anxiety, and trauma. And I believe you said you did higher levels of care as well. You have experience with that, correct?
It's both higher level and lower level of care and therapy.
Beautiful. All right. Well, on top of that, I'd like to just give a little disclaimer to those of you joining that we're going to be talking about some difficult topics today, but it's all with the goal of creating awareness and helping you to feel less alone. So if you feel like that can help you, then please stick around. Sam, I think the things that you help your clients with, overcoming anxiety and healing from trauma is a common thing that we see in the mental health community for Gen Z, but especially during the holidays. The holiday season is a time to spend with family, and that's a wonderful, wonderful thing. But if you're someone who doesn't have a really healthy or happy relationship with your family, sometimes it can be really stress or anxiety inducing. The American Psychological Association found that 38% of people have their stress increase during the holiday season. And the National Alliance on Mental Illness found that 64% of individuals living with a mental illness felt that their conditions worsened around the holidays. I'm somebody who struggles with obsessive compulsive disorder and ADHD. And I have noticed that both of those tend to get a little bit worse around the holiday seasons, not only because I'm expecting to see my family, but also because of the busyness of it as well. So Soluna did a poll recently on their app asking, what is your least favorite topic to discuss at the holiday dinner table? And that's the conversation that Sam and I are going to have today. So the topics that you guys had seen were the latest in politics, dating or relationship status, post-graduation plans, and religious debates. I have encountered all of these at the dinner table, and not just the holiday dinner table. The highest one was the latest in politics at 33%. So we're going to touch on that one first. Now, for my family, this was a common one at the dinner table. It didn't matter what holiday, Christmas, Easter, 4th of July, doesn't matter. It was always brought up. In my family, we have hardcore and passionate conservatives and hardcore and passionate liberals. And there would always be a lot of yelling because of how much passion people have behind their political views. People cannot agree. And eventually the conversation would turn from political opinions to attacks on people's character. So judging them as an individual and a person rather than just hearing them out for what they believe and what they support. And so in those types of situations, what suggestions can you give to people to cope when they're sitting at the dinner table and this conversation starts to escalate, Sam?
I love that question. And I know that you mentioned your little disclaimer earlier. So I will also, my little disclaimer here is that this live is by no means a substitute for therapy. So we're going to be talking all things suggestions, tips, tools, but I really do encourage anyone who is struggling with their mental health, would like to dive further into inner child work, trauma work, really just exploring their anxiety, OCD, ADHD, really can reach out to referrals in their area, resources in their area, as well as even insurance companies have referrals. So I do just, again, want to disclaim that this is not a substitute for therapy, while we will be talking all things strategies. So with that being said, Lauren, I think you make a great point of like having kind of these a little toolbox for into these situations. And I know the two main topics, right, of politics and relationships, speaking on the kind of politic conversation that could take place, is it's really important that we minimize the pressure on ourselves for other people's comments, right? So a lot of times we're sitting at that dinner table and we hear conversations that we might be feeling a little uncomfortable with, and then your uncle or your aunt or a parent or a grandparent makes a comment that you feel really uncomfortable with. It's extremely important that sitting there, you don't personalize it, right? So being able to recognize that their comment is not a direct reflection on you, your values, and your beliefs, and being able to understand that it often is a reflection on how they're feeling and being able to separate the two.
I absolutely love that. Disconnecting from what they're saying, from like who you are, is so important, because oftentimes when it's our family members, especially when it's our parents, we think like, oh my goodness, I think so differently from you. How could you believe these things? And it genuinely hurts you as a person. But realizing that it's not an attack on you directly, that you can be a different person with different beliefs, with different choices in your life than your parents or whoever raised you, and you can still create a like happy, healthy environment with them. That takes two players though, right? So when we're at the dinner table and the conversation starts to escalate and get a little bit rough, sometimes there can be yelling involved. In my experience, sometimes there's been cursing involved, because curses are just thrown around like they aren't a big deal, but they are. And if you're somebody who has seen that a lot in your life, it can cause the fight or flight, right? So what's some things that we can do when we're sitting at the dinner table and that conversation starts to go in a direction where we start to feel unsafe, to help us through that?
So I think that really brings us right back to this amazing piece of inner child work, right? Like learning
Right.
triggers, learning what will potentially escalate that fight or flight feeling within you and inside of you. And after I share kind of the therapeutic perspective, I would love to hear what maybe you have personally done for yourself. But I think in this case scenario, it's really important to understand what works for you, right? There's no such thing as good, bad, healthy, unhealthy. We're really going to be able to tailor our needs to us. And I use the word our because I think we've all been in a really uncomfortable situation that we don't know how to navigate or manage. So
Right.
when the volume starts to escalate and curses are starting to be thrown around and you're starting to feel really uncomfortable, I think there's multiple layers and ways to look at the situation, right? Whether it be being able to remove yourself from the conversation. That's not always an option for people. So I do want to keep that in mind, right? You can't always get up from the table and step outside or remove yourself from the room that you're in. So being able to have kind of that backup plan or that next step. So it could be turning on music if you have headphones in already. It can be sending a text message to a friend. Sometimes it even looks like journaling in your phone, right? I know
Mhm.
we know journaling to be an extremely helpful tool and technique, but it's not always accessible to us. So finding what is accessible. Before kind of, I know I want to mention something that is going to really help both aspects of conversations and navigating difficult conversations, which is also called a cope ahead plan. So I
Mm.
think that is going to be maybe a whole nother topic that after we hear maybe what you've done in situations and yelling that we can kind of circle back to.
Yeah, I would love to hear what a cope ahead plan is. That sounds like a blueprint that would be super, super helpful. But to touch upon what you said, like removing yourself from the conversation, right? And understanding what triggers you already have. And that might tie into a cope ahead plan, like knowing how you're going to respond to certain things can prepare you. And I loved that you called it a little toolbox. With my therapist, I've referred to my resources as my little toolkit. I'm going to pack my toolkit. I'm going to go home to New York and I'm going to spend the holidays with my family and I'm going to remember the tools I have in my toolkit. It's like a little fanny pack, you know?
Mhm.
Um, Anyways, so in my toolkit, the things that I've used in the past is when I lived at home, if I felt that a conversation was escalating at the dinner table in a way that I wasn't comfortable with or where I was being triggered by, I would go up to my room. If I was in my house, if I was at like my mom's family's house or something, I would go up to her bedroom or some bedroom where I know I was allowed to go and I was allowed to just sit there and decompress.
Mhm.
Sometimes my cousins would join me because a few of my cousins are very understanding and like to validate others' emotions. So I'll sit with them. We're all around the same age. We all feel the same way about the conversation that is being had at the dinner table. So we'll just go and kind of hang out. And sometimes we won't say anything. We'll just be in the same room, writing stuff on our phone, calling friends, like just being in the same environment with other people you know understand what it's like to sit at that table
Right.
is very helpful. Another place I'll go is just outside. You know, if you have a dog, you can go walk your dog. I had a cat, so couldn't do that. But I would step outside and I would just breathe in a little bit, take a few deep breaths, look around at the trees in my neighborhood, and just being outside in the cool, crisp air would kind of calm me down a little bit. When I get really agitated, my cheeks get really red and I get kind of nervous. So um, I would take a second to decompress, kind of remember who I am and that I am safe and remind myself of that. And then I would step back inside when I felt the time was right. With that being said, when I was much younger, I didn't really have an option to leave the dinner table all the time. As I got older, I had more freedom. But in a lot of families, it's considered rude if you get up from the dinner table just because you don't like the conversation. And then I would make myself a target and I would get in trouble later on, probably in a much worse way than if I had just joined the conversation. So in those situations, and please tell me if this was like probably not the best thing to do, because I don't know if it's borderline dissociation, but sometimes I would choose to just stay silent. I realized it was not worth speaking if I was not going to be heard or understood by the other person. And I saw it more as protecting my energy. So even if what the person is saying is terribly wrong or terribly insensitive, which it was a lot of the time, it wasn't worth trying to change their mind with my opinion because they didn't want their mind changed. They didn't want to hear what I have to say. So the biggest thing I could have done to respect myself and protect my peace was to not engage. Mm-hmm. And again, didn't want to make myself a target. Now, with that being said, I would have pent up feelings. So later I would have to go and deal with those, whether it was journaling or like, I love making video journals on my phone. I'll just put my phone up, not an app or anything, just on the camera app, and just be like, today was really hard because of da-da-da-da. And it's also fun to watch those back later to see how I've changed and grown. But yeah, those are the things that I would use. I would love to hear your opinions on all of that.
So there's one thing that really kind of stood out to me, which you said is, tell me if this is good or bad, right? So I just want to first acknowledge that component, because I think, again, it's really important to recognize that there's no such thing as good and bad when it comes to your toolbox, right? Some things are better suited for some people, right? If somebody says to a client, like, take a deep breath, for some clients that might make them more anxious. It might make breathing a little bit more difficult. And that might work for you, right? So being able to understand that good and bad is such a relative term when it comes to therapy, right? We might look at something as healthy and unhealthy, right? We look at healthy coping skills, maladaptive coping skills. So in that sense, we might look at what is beneficial for us as a person. But the good and bad, I really like to kind of erase as a topic, because again, there's no such thing as good and bad when it comes to tools.
Right.
I want to kind of circle back though to your point of like just staying silent at the table, right? And for, again, some people that is the most beneficial thing. You hear the term bite your tongue, right? Sometimes what you might say could only fuel the entire conversation. So yes, staying quiet and reserved could be an amazing coping skill for some people and an amazing tool to use. But I also want to acknowledge that sometimes stating how you're feeling can also be really powerful. So maybe that looks like saying, I don't want to engage in this conversation right now. This conversation is making me uncomfortable. Kind of going back to the raising of the voice or cursing. Hey, do we mind lowering our voices? It's really triggering me right now. If you feel comfortable in the safe space that you are in. I know you also mentioned stepping outside and getting some fresh air. I love to use this skill with a lot of my clients in trauma work and inner child work, the concept of safe space visualization. So I don't know if that's something that you've been familiar with at all. Different therapists call it different things. So what it essentially looks like is creating and imagining what your safe place would be. So sometimes I even tell people to think about that at the table, right? If you're feeling really triggered and your anxiety is heightened and you are feeling that fight or flight freeze start to come on, to be able to just pause and sit in your chair and create that safe place in your mind for you, right? So like for me, that would be the beach or the mountains. Like that is what I would picture. That is what I would imagine. And being able to take yourself there and realize that you're not in danger, but you're not feeling comfortable or safe, and really differentiating the two. So I find that really helpful for clients. I've used the safe space visualization myself in terms of like feeling uncomfortable and wanting to bring myself to a happy place, right? So it doesn't always just need to be used in a triggering environment or situation, but it is one that I know has been super helpful for people.
Right, absolutely. I love that. And I have heard of the safe space visualization. I've heard it specifically for inner child work, where when you're trying to heal from a traumatic memory in your past, you can take yourself at that age. So let's say me at 6 years old, right? And I would put her in like a bedroom, and I would design that bedroom in my head however I wanted it to look, however my 6-year-old self would have. Like, I put a little dance studio in there. I have a Barbie dream house. I have a canopy bed. You know, I have all these cutesy things that I would have loved as a kid. And I can go into that room and I can talk to her about something that traumatic that happened to me at that age. For me, it was about my parents' divorce, that I went into that room and I talked to her through it the way I would have wanted my parents to talk me through it, rather than the way that they actually did. And then I would put her to sleep and I would turn off the light and I would close the door. And for me, that was just so incredibly healing. But I never heard of doing that same thing when you're in the moment. And I think that is so cool, because our minds are very powerful things, right? So they can convince us of the worst case scenario, which for people like me, they often default there. But we have to train ourselves to think of like the best case scenario, or think of like, I can imagine whatever I want. I might as well imagine that I'm not here and in a much safer place, because at the very least, what it's going to do for you is it's going to lower your heart rate and make you feel safe again. And once you feel safe again, you can make better choices about how you want to proceed forward, whether that is speaking up and setting a boundary, or leaving the conversation, or choosing to stay silent. It puts you back in a calmer state, which will give you more control. So I love that. That's awesome. Also, just a note, the way you speak is so soft and intentional and straightforward and slow. And I ramble a lot. I feel like I'm talking to my therapist a little bit. It's so funny. Okay, well, let's move on to the next one. So the second highest one we saw was dating or relationship status. So a lot of what we talked about for political conversations, we can actually apply here too. You see that got 29%. So it's up there as well. For me personally, this is going to kind of go hand in hand with, you know, choosing to stay silent. So when someone asks, are you dating anyone? Are you seeing any boys? What's going on in your life? You know, I like to not lie, but I like to lie. And what I mean by that is think LIE, little information every time. I will sprinkle truths here and there, but I won't give the full story. Because like I said, with staying silent, I only feel the need to speak when I'm going to be heard and be understood. And I'm not going to be. Half the time, they just want to see if there's something they can judge me on, or they want to see if I'm moving my life in the right direction. And culturally, for me, I come from a Hispanic family, and I know this isn't only for Hispanics, it's for many other cultures as well. It's not worth mentioning that you're dating someone unless like your intention is to get married. Because I know the minute I introduce whoever I'm seeing to my family, it's like, oh, so is it serious? How serious is it? When did you meet? What did you do? And I don't want to tell all these stories to, again, when it's going to fall on deaf ears, when it's not really going to matter. It kind of is like when I feel like the most common question for Gen Z is like, how's school going? Because most of us are in school. And most of the time, they didn't care what my answer was. They actually don't care to ask me. The only thing they want me to say is, I'm doing well. I'm getting straight A's. They want something that gives them fuel to be like, oh, look at how impressive my niece or daughter is. You know, it wasn't really about me. And I feel like that's all of the small talk that happens at the dinner table when you come from that type of family. So when it comes to dating or relationships, or any question that you're asked about your own personal life, you can give as little information as you want. And again, that puts it back in your power. So Sam, I was wondering if you had any thoughts on that.
So I think this is a great place to circle back to the Cope Ahead plan, because it's something that, I mean, I can tell you 9 times out of 10 sessions around the holidays are Cope Ahead plans. So it is fresh on my mind. But what I love about a Cope Ahead plan is there are certain situations you can plan for, or you can't necessarily plan every detail, but you know the event that's about to happen. So something that I even love are like, there are apps out there. There are templates on Google of Cope Ahead plans, and they're not difficult to navigate, right? It could be something that you write down beforehand. Maybe you bring to therapy and discuss beforehand, like I've been doing probably this entire past month. But really being able to navigate a situation beforehand so that you feel more comfortable and confident going into it. So let's kind of use the dating relationship question as a pure example, right? It's something that you're going into the holiday knowing it's going to be asked, right? Like,
Mhm.
hey, are you seeing anyone? Are you dating? If maybe you've been dating for a while, when are you getting engaged? What
Yeah.
comes next? Are you guys moving in together? I mean, I can go on and on about the possible questions that are going to potentially be asked, but even writing those out beforehand, right? Then we can sit down and
Mm.
say, okay, what feelings is this bringing up for you, right? Is this bringing up any form of like inadequacy if you're not seeing somebody? Are you maybe embarrassed by saying, no, I'm not dating right now, I am
Right.
single, right? What is that bringing up? What feelings are surfacing for you? What emotions are you feeling? And then also there comes the what do you respond or what comes next. So I'm interested to hear kind of from your perspective, again, being the person who is in it, understands it, and also
Right.
sees the intention behind maybe not sharing everything and sharing
Mhm.
little pieces of information, but not lying. Um, if you had to have like a go-to response, kind of picking out those things, right? So I'm wondering, like, from your perspective, like, what would an adequate, and I use the quotes because, again, completely relative to the person, but what would a response look like if you get the question and you're getting a chance to think about it beforehand, right? We're not sitting at the
Right.
table, we're just having a
Yeah.
conversation. What is a response you would feel comfortable with sharing?
This is perfect timing because I'm going home for Christmas, and I didn't plan on it, so it's just kinda happening, and I know for a fact I will be asked this question, and I don't know how I want to answer, but I can look at how I've answered in the past and see what the responses have been then.
Yeah.
So, in the past, one of my go-to responses is, "Oh, I go on dates, but I haven't really settled on someone." And so moving forward, I don't want to keep giving that same response because I feel like they're going to catch on eventually. But I could do some version of that, like, oh, I'm going on dates and seeing what happens. And that leaves it kind of open ended. And there is truth in that. It's not necessarily a lie, but it's not the full truth. It's just, yeah, I've been on dates in the past year. I have seen where they went. That's the truth. I don't need to give names. I don't need to go into details because I noticed for me, once I start giving details and names, that's when I start to get anxious. The
Right.
other answer, the very simple general answer, doesn't give me feelings of inadequacy because I'm so comfortable in who I am and I know who I actually am. And I don't need anybody's responses messing with my thoughts in my brain of who I am. And I know the more details I give, the more they're going to share their opinions. And then I'm going to take those opinions as fact because that's what I used to do. And it's easy for me to fall into that trap. For other people, though, it might be that giving a very general answer makes them feel like they're not as convincing, or I'm not so worried about that anymore. Used to be, though. So I just kind of have to see, right, where sharing too much or too little make what that makes me feel like, and then deciding from there what the best response would be to give.
Yeah. And I think, again, it goes back to that what you feel comfortable with, right?
Yeah.
Like when you feel comfortable sharing and expressing, it makes it more genuine and authentic to yourself, right? If you
Mhm.
came in with this whole made up story about this person you're seeing and where things are going from here, right? It makes you feel a little bit more less confident, right? Going into the situation of like, I don't know what my answer is going to be. So even if it's not an answer that you're so secure in or you're so happy about giving, it at least is something that you know you have almost like that default to. Right. And I
Right.
think that's like what a huge benefit of this cope ahead plan is that it doesn't always need to go according to plan, but you have
Right.
your kind of like go-to lines that maybe you haven't used in the past, or something very short as I don't really want to talk about my dating life. It's not fun out there, right? Like,
Right.
I mean, I use sarcasm with my clients all the time. Again, a tool that won't always work, but maybe you have that like really funny uncle who just doesn't actually take that question serious when they're asking you, and you're like,
Right.
I got it covered. Thanks for your like being able to almost just have those witty lines or those that toolbox, right, that you can just
Right.
pull from, and that's what's so helpful about the cope ahead plan. And if it doesn't go according to plan and you're feeling super uncomfortable or there's a ton of feelings that are surfacing afterwards, at least you have that again to bring to your journal, your phone,
Mhm.
a therapy session coming up and being like, you know what, this was really uncomfortable for me, but I was able to get through it.
Right. Absolutely. I love you said like having a plan afterwards in case things don't go according to plan for the co-ed plan. Because I was going to bring that up. I was going to say, there have been situations where I had this plan of what I was going to say, but in the moment, I was so excited to talk about someone I was dating, or I was so excited to talk about a new job or something that I did let it all out. Because at the end of the day, you do love these things, you're excited about them, and when you naturally want to share them. So sometimes it would come out, and I realized immediately afterwards, this was not the person to tell about that. This was not good. And so it brings up those feelings of insecurity, of stress, of anxiety, right? Something that I've thought is great to have that my therapist taught me was grounding techniques. And, it could be journaling or breathing. But one thing that I feel like is so simple that you can kind of do anywhere is I would repeat to myself things that I knew were true and simple. So like, for example, right now, if I was having a panic attack, I would tell myself, okay, my hair is brown. I'm wearing a yellow sweater. It is snowing outside. Your name is Sam. These are like very simple truths, and it grounds me back to reality instead of like future spiraling about like, oh, I said this and now they're going to think this and now this is going to happen and da 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 da. And for someone like me with OCD, the future spiraling happens a lot. So it's just good to ground myself back into reality and have that be part of my toolkit or my cope ahead plan, just in case things don't go according to how I think they will. And as we know, that always ends up happening. So yeah.
And I love that you just mentioned like the grounding techniques, right? Because that's something that is so tangible. There's one, and what you mentioned kind of like the facts in therapy term, we use the idea of like fact checking, right? Like we can check the facts to know what is true and what is false in that moment. But then you also mentioned the idea of grounding, which I absolutely love. I use all the time. My favorite go-to one, especially for the holidays, is the idea of like 5, 4, 3, 2, 1. I'm not sure if you're familiar with that at all.
Yes. Yes.
But a great, easy technique and tool that you can use just sitting there, right? You don't necessarily need your phone, a pen, a piece of paper, another person. And what that looks like is identifying 5 things that you can see, 4 things that you can hear, 3 things you can smell, and really going through that in your brain, again, all the way down to 1, using your 5 senses, but being able to really keep yourself present and where you are in the moment and grounded at the same time. Again, it's something that you can just do in the back of your head, and you don't need anything external for that.
Right. And those I feel like are the most helpful, because sometimes when you are panicking like that, it's really hard to remember, let me start journaling, let me open the notes app, it's just like, no, count, yeah, or state the facts. And it's much easier that way. I want to take us to another question, and because this one stood out to me. What are 5 things to remember during the holidays? And I'd like, as we're discussing these 5 things, to go hand in hand with my first experience back home, because I feel like it'll give us, if we have any examples, it could be a good starting off point to like run through therapeutic scenarios. My first time that I visited home after moving away from home was 6 months into living by myself. And in those 6 months, I had done so much healing. I was working with a therapist and a life coach, so double whammy there, and just learning so much about myself and how to live on my own and all these wounds I was trying to work through and process that I never did. And so when I went to go home, it was for Christmas, so it was in December, and I had this itinerary that I made where I was like, this day I'm going to go to Rockefeller Center at 11 a.m. I'm going to go have lunch with my cousin at 12 p.m. And all of my days were planned out. I bought tickets to things, and I did it purely so I wasn't stuck in my house with nowhere to go, because that would have been the worst case scenario for me, because then I would have felt trapped. And my biggest thing is I can't put myself in situations where I feel like I don't have a choice, where I feel trapped. So I planned out everything to a T. But then when I got there, there was a new COVID variant and everything had shut down again. And so because of that, I wasn't allowed to go anywhere for that time period. And I had to stay home with my family, which is the one thing I wanted to avoid, because I knew it was going to cause me stress and anxiety, and it did. So there were things that I learned from that experience that got me through every single time I went to go visit my family in the future. And just to clarify, I love my family. They're great. It's just sometimes, things are said that aren't very kind, and you got to process them. So I want to start with one thing for the 5 things you can remember during the holidays. The holidays are just as much for you as they are for everyone else. How can you reclaim the holidays as your own? And how can you self-soothe if it doesn't go according to plan? Now, we talked about that a little bit with grounding techniques, but in terms of reclaiming the holidays, this will actually bring us a little bit into inner child work, because I love to remember how I enjoyed the holidays as a kid. And one of my favorite things to do was watch those like stop motion animation movies about like Santa Claus is coming to town, or Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer, just those old classic cartoons. I would love to watch them. I had toys that represented the characters in the show, and I would always watch Elf and make hot cocoa. So I had things that I built as traditions over time that I didn't realize I was doing as a kid. And in trying to heal my inner child, I was like, okay, well, I may be stuck at home and can't go anywhere, but I can put on Rudolph the Red-Nosed Reindeer. I can watch Elf. I could watch the Santa Clauses. I can make hot chocolate. There are things I can do to reclaim this Christmas as my own, even though my plan I can't do anymore. So yeah, just what are your thoughts on that?
So it's so interesting because I love the idea of reclaiming for yourself, right? And I also, in the back of my mind, was thinking it really goes the opposite way too, right? For some people, the holidays were not something that they wanted to enjoy, right? They had a traumatic event happen at a younger age surrounding the holidays, and now all of a sudden they were coming into the holiday saying, well, I don't really have any tradition, or I don't really have any like go-to movies that I typically watch. Being able to reclaim that in the complete opposite sense, right? Like being able to create almost like a child you holiday, and that could be doing the same things that you mentioned, right? Making chocolate, putting on a child Christmas movie that you typically, right, would watch. And almost just recreating and redoing what you want the holidays to be in your mind. So that's kind of where my mind went, is like the complete opposite. Like let's make the holidays what we want them to be, maybe not what they used to be.
Absolutely. Absolutely. Because if you're someone who didn't have those experiences as a kid, it's super important to be like, well, then what does this holiday mean to me? How can I own it or not own it if that's the direction I decide to go in? It's all about putting yourself in a position of power and control, and understanding now that you are growing up, this is your life. And the things that you were taught necessarily aren't the things you have to repeat as you continue forward. Love that. And now I want to go to the second point real quick. So the second thing I thought of things to remember during the holidays: other people's judgments of you are a reflection of how they feel about themselves. Now, because we both, I personally had an eating disorder for 2 years and healed from it, and you work with people who have struggled with eating disorders, I think this is a great, great thing to bring up, because people will judge you for everything. And we kind of talked about this earlier with relationships and with grades in school, but food is a big thing. For me, I have been judged on how much less or more I weighed every Christmas by my family. And, it didn't matter what I did or didn't do. If they saw how much food was on my plate, they would make a comment. If they saw how I looked that year, they would make a comment. If they saw what I was wearing and how it flattered me or didn't, there would be a comment. And what I learned over time was that these comments that I would get, mostly from the women in my family, is that they were taught these judgments when they were my age. So they have instilled those judgments in themselves, like, oh, I have to make sure I'm always small, or, oh, I have to make sure my hair and makeup's always perfect. I have to make sure when I go to a family event or a holiday event that I am dressed to impress, because I am going to be judged and critiqued. And because they have instilled this in themselves, then that gets passed down to me and my cousins, and now we get judged for how we look whenever we are at a family gathering. And it was making that connect that I'm like, their judgments are not personal to me. Them as a human, they don't really care if I like weigh more, what I wear or don't wear, but they're worried about how I'm going to be perceived, because they're worried about how they're going to be perceived. So it's a pass down. It's a generational thing. And understanding that, I was able to kind of make their comments to me less personal. It isn't about me. It's about them. And they're trying to protect themselves by dressing up. So they're also, in a way, trying to protect me, but they're doing it in a way where they're judging me and they're hurting my feelings, and they don't even realize it. So just any comments that are made to you, I would say majority of the time, if not all the time, are people's judgments of themselves that they don't even realize, and they're just passing it down. So it has nothing to do with you. Therefore, it's false. And that, I don't know, that helped me so much.
And that's what we call kind of intergenerational trauma, right? Like what is passed down isn't always a reflection on you, right? It's
Mhm.
learned and it's environmental. Just kind of going off of your point though of like that is a reflection on them. Something I always kind of tap into is that circle of control, right? What
Mm,
is in your control and what is out of your control? And something that is completely out of your control are the comments that other people are going to make, right?
mhm.
If you could control those, they wouldn't occur.
Right.
So what you can control is your response to those comments, right? So if we're talking kind of eating disorder focused, right? You can control your next step or your next move or what you do with those comments. If we're talking previous trauma, right? You can
Mhm.
control your reaction. You can leave the room and use your grounding skills. You can leave the room and pull whatever it is from your toolbox. So I
Right.
always love to remember, especially kind of if we're talking those 5 things around the holidays, is always keep in mind what's in your control and what's out of your control. And that's something that has really been helpful for people as well.
I love that too. I've heard a lot of the time that, like, similar to how you said, people, you can't control what other people say or do, right? But you can control how you respond and then how you feel afterwards. Now, a little baby point I want to touch upon that is I always was confused by that because I'm like, if someone says something hurtful, I can't really control the fact that I'm sad right after. So I feel like there's an initial response that is natural, and then there's a response that you choose that comes after the initial response. And we
Right.
don't need to like beat ourselves up about the initial response. Like, of course, if someone says something that triggers you, you're going to feel sad or angry or upset, and that's okay and that's normal. And you are allowed to have those feelings for however long you want to have them, for however long it serves you to have them. But then there is a response you get to control that comes after the initial response. And you can choose then, do I want to continue feeling sad? Do I want to allow this to ruin my holiday? Can I disconnect it right now from who I am as a person, who I know I am, to who they are perceiving me as, which is two totally different ideas. Nobody really perceives you how you truly are.
Mhm.
So knowing that, that can help you to kind of be like, okay, my initial response was my initial response, and I can own that. And I'm happy that my body can understand that was a hurtful comment. So I don't say those things to other people. I'm grateful for that. And I'm also grateful that now I get to choose my next response. So,
Right. And that's something, I mean, I just kind of keeping timing in mind. I could talk about for
yeah.
hours on it.
Oh, absolutely. Yeah.
But your initial response sometimes is that form of control for you, right? Like a lot
Absolutely.
of
Yeah.
people who immediately just would feel sad would try and push away or suppress
Hmm.
that emotion. You have control over the ability to feel it, to process it, and then to choose what you do next, right? So sometimes even acknowledging that initial reaction or emotion is part of what is in your control.
Absolutely. Yeah. I love that. Like I said, for however long it serves you, you can feel whatever that initial response is because that at your core is its truth, right? It's your truth of how you feel. I
100%.
love that. All right, for time's sakes, let's go on to number 3. We actually talked about this one already. It was you do not owe anyone anything. Most conversations are formalities. So, in the 5 things to remember for the holiday season, that's the third thing I would want people to remember. We talked about it with like grades and dating and stuff like that, things you don't mention. So let's hop over to number 4. And this is what I came up with. So just because you don't have the same family as your friends or the ones you see on TV, and I'm talking about those families that are in all Christmas movies, they love each other, they can't wait to be with each other, all that good stuff. It does not mean, just because you don't have that family, it does not mean that you are any less deserving of love for who you truly are. And I feel like that's one of the hardest things because if people did have families where they could love spending the holidays with them, love having dinner with them every single evening, and know that they were going to go home and be validated for how they were feeling, that they were going to go home and find stress relief at the end of a long day, it would create so much more healthy individuals. But unfortunately, a lot of us don't have that, for various reasons. And so I just want people who are watching to know that regardless of anything that happens at family dinner during the holidays, you are not any less deserving of love because of it. At your core, you are a good person, you are a good individual, and you deserve love and care and respect like all of us. Sam, I don't know if you have any thoughts you wanted to add on to that. It's just an important reminder for myself too.
No, I absolutely love that. And I think that that comes with self worth, self confidence, self
Mhm.
passion, right? I mean, I again could talk probably another 45 minutes on just this one component, but I do love to hear that.
Amazing. And this is actually very similar to the fifth thing that I wrote for the 5 things to remember during the holidays. It will not be like this forever. Sam and I both touched on like recreating the holidays in the future to what it was when you were a kid, or what you would rather have it had been when you were a kid, making it what you want to be. And our brains are very poor predictors for the future, because our brains only predict based on past and present events. So one day you might move. One day you might have your own family. One day you might be closer with someone else's family than your own. And I personally had that. The best Christmas of my life was last year. I spent it in Star Valley, Nevada, this rural like cattle ranch town. I've never been in a town that small. I got like home cooked meals every day. It was my coworker's family who was just so warm and so welcoming to me. And I'm like, if I ever get to create a Christmas for a family, this is what I would want to do. And so it's just opening yourself up to those experiences and knowing that those experiences are in store for you, because your brain literally cannot predict the future and things will get better one day. And therapy is a huge part of that. So like Sam had said earlier, if you feel like that's something you can use, that's something you should go to, correct?
I agree.
All right. Well, we're getting close to our time here. I think we have about 5 minutes left. So Sam, I just wanted to know, did you have any like lasting thoughts that you wanted to tell people? We've talked a lot about boundary setting. We talked a lot about avoiding difficult conversations. We've talked a lot about healing your inner child, and just disconnecting from the things that people say to you that might come off as personal attacks, and getting to know who you are at your core and remembering who you are to help you through the holiday season. I just want to know if there's any lasting things we haven't touched on that you think are important to mention.
I think the one thing that does come to mind is what boundaries mean, right? So boundaries doesn't mean that you love someone less, that you don't like them, that you want to hurt someone, right? And I think that that's something that's really important to remember, is that boundaries are something that you set for yourself because you need them, and it'll make you feel more comfortable and more self-assured and more self-aware. And I think, again, I know we briefly touched on boundaries, and I think that it's something that is so important for you to evaluate in your own life, right? Whether it be in therapy, whether it be with your loved ones, friends, relationships. Boundaries look different in different aspects of your life, but it's something that I always will remind clients of, that you're not doing anything wrong by setting a boundary. You're doing something that is helpful for you. And I think that that is kind of the last thing that I would definitely love to kind of put out there and remind people of, is that there is no wrong by setting a boundary.
I love that you said that, because sometimes that is the hardest thing to remember. And sometimes setting boundaries is so anxiety inducing that you think if it triggers anxiety, it must be bad, it must be wrong. And it's like, no, you're just not used to it yet. And that's okay. Over time, you can get used to things that are good for you. It's just at first, it's going to feel a little bit uncomfortable. And that's part of the growing pains of the process, right? And how people respond to your boundaries, whether they respond negatively, like that is not indicative that no, you shouldn't have set the boundaries. I've had tons of experiences like that where I'm setting a boundary for the first time, it gets received really poorly. And it's not that I learn I can't set boundaries with this individual. It's just the boundaries that I set with this individual have to go about a little bit differently. And that's something I would talk with my therapist about. So it's always helpful to schedule a therapy appointment. But all right, there's the last few things I'd like to mention. We're so excited for the Soluna launch in January of 2024. This app is going to be available for everyone in the state of California between the ages of 13 and 25. So Gen Z, this is for you. Stay tuned for at least one live event each month, which will be announced on the app. So on the app, you can use the feedback submission page to tell us what topics you'd like us to cover and what you'd like to see in future events, and any other feedback you have as well. You can find this feedback feature under your profile settings at the bottom of the page and click the Submit Feedback button. And with that final point, I hope regardless of where you spend your holidays or who you spend it with, that you stay healthy and happy this December. Thank you so much for watching, and I hope all of you have a lovely day. Thanks so much, Sam.
Thank you, Lauren.
Yeah.